Hello, my name is Ross Downing. This paper is entitled Wælcyrge, or Witchcraft, Identifying Heathendom in Late Anglo-Danish England. This paper will highlight the possible relationships between survivals of early Anglo-Saxon paganism and the references to so-called heathen practices and beliefs in the late Viking Age. The main data used in my focus will be the work of Wulfstan, writing in an Anglo-Danish or mixed Anglo-Saxon and Viking England. Supporting sources and evidence from this period will also be included. Please note this presentation features images and descriptions of mass murder, violence towards women, and sexual violence. The presentation will be in 5 parts. Firstly, I'll discuss the focus, the data, and the broader context. The following 3 parts will be broken down in an elementary chronology. And finally, I will present some of the conclusions that I've gained from looking at this data. This paper aims to contribute to the communication between the very active field of the study of Old Norse religions, also called sonar, and the study of Anglo-Saxon paganism, which is generally speaking not its own field. One reason for the disparity of activity between the 2 subjects or data sets is probably because all Nordic countries teach Old Norse and Old Norse religion at some of their universities, whereas Old English is only taught at one university in the UK and very seldom elsewhere. So Anglo-Saxon paganism is generally limited to specialization of certain archaeologists. My hope is that this paper will eventually encourage scholars of sonar to begin using more Anglo-Saxon data, and for the 2 areas, scholars of the 2 areas to work together more. I will be mainly zeroing in on the records from the reign of Canute the Great, the reason being that it is a period where Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse paganisms can be argued to coexist. This gives us the benefit of comparative method and understanding cross-cultural syncretism. Sermons and law codes are particularly convincing pieces of evidence for religious practices, since if they were not active threats, there would be little need to preach about them or forbid them. Although this is not a watertight theory, of course, there is consistency and a range of textual evidence that makes the whole argument quite compelling, I think, as you will find out. What I will not be doing is to give a full account of Anglo-Saxon and Viking interactions. I will not define Anglo-Saxon paganism. I will not go into defining Viking paganism. I will not qualify what survived the Anglo-Saxon conversion or the Viking conversion. I will not quantify the amount of heathens or their activities during Christian governance. And I won't fully explore gender issues that have traditionally been covered in witch trial studies. I will, however, explore and reflect on joint complexes and contexts of heathen and Christian identities, English and Danish, and heresy, magic, and religion. Some basic research questions are who is doing the identification? Who is being identified as heathen, as witch, or even as Valkyrie? Why are they being identified as such? And what is the criteria for being identified as such? And one of the real head scratchers I have had is, how is it possible for a real human being to be accused of being a Valkyrie in the same vein as he or she might be accused of being a witch? Much of this timeline will be familiar to you, but for those in the audience who are unfamiliar with the field, it might be useful just to put this into a chronological perspective. This bullet list covers time from the Anglo-Saxon invasion or settlement from countries like Denmark and the Low Countries to Roman Britain, and up to the Norman conquest, which is roughly the span of 700 years, and that is deemed Anglo-Saxon history. The first 250 years of that history, we have very limited historical primary source textual information, and that is traditionally why it's called the Dark Ages. The latter half of Anglo-Saxon history is the Viking Age. The context of Anglo-Saxon history and paganism begins really with Saint Bede, who began writing about Anglo-Saxon paganism around the year 700. It is unlikely that heathen practices had entirely vanished from the population during his time, since the last pagan king died about 15 years after Saint Bede was born. And about 50 years after Bede's death, the Viking Age begins. And from the very first historical event, we have a religious situation there. Christian holy sites are raided. The word heathen and the Latin words gentile or Gentile and the Latin word pagan is used to refer to the raiders. They were from Norway and Denmark and attacked all the British Isles, including Ireland. Now, Alcuin, sorry, I keep going forward there. Alcuin was an English monk from York, which was the administrative capital for the area where the first Viking raids were being carried out. However, at the time, Alcuin had already taken a position as an abbot in central France. So he was quite away from the action. But when he heard about it, he wrote to the monks that he'd left behind in northern England that the Vikings were like unholy warriors, and that the English had been, including the monks themselves, had been sinful, and that the Vikings were their divine punishment. Alcuin also reflects on the idea of national and ethnic sovereignty for the Anglo-Saxon English. He says, this has been our country for 350 years. And now these heathen foreigners, ironically from the same land the Anglo-Saxons came from, but that's neither here nor there. And this is a theme, this ethnic sovereignty, this idea of this nationalism, and the idea of the Danes being unholy and coming with a foreign religion, is a theme that continues well into the Norman period. The great turning point in Anglo-Saxon history is Alfred the Great. He negotiates a military truce with the Vikings, and this sets the boundaries for the Scandinavian settlement. Now, that settlement was called the Danelaw, and it covered at its height roughly the northeastern half of England in a line from London up to Liverpool. This situation placed the Archbishopric of York, which was the most important ecclesiastical and administrative centre for the Anglo-Saxon state of England, outside of England, in foreign and non-Christian hands. Alfred demanded that the Danes convert to Christianity as part of the truce. But we don't know how much the native English church infrastructure was able to influence and control the religious lives of the population in the Danelaw. Roughly a century after Alfred the Great, the Viking king Canute the Great sits on the throne of England, as well as Denmark and Norway at the same time. Denmark and Norway were only nominally Christian during the reign of Canute the Great. It was Canute's father or grandfather, Harold Bluetooth, who was the first king in Scandinavia to convert to Christianity. Therefore, at the time of Wulfstan's writing, we have ethnic, political, and religious diversity, which the Anglo-Danish government, which included the English church, were desperately trying to control. So the first third of our chronology we'll look at the earliest references to beliefs and practices of paganism. And these go back to the laws of the first Christian ruler of Kent. Law 84 does not continue in later law codes. So this indicates that this law was situation specific to its day, and that situation was heathen. The law code represents, or the alphabet represents a heathen England at the time. So according to Law 84, a Gjengang was a woman who returned from the dead. So if she returned from the dead, she could be fined. And we find a similar situation in medieval Icelandic sagas like Eyrbyggja saga, where we're told about a mass haunting in the village of what is now Froðaheiði. And the locals who aren't from the village, because everyone in the village is dead, the surrounding neighbors go over to sort it out and tell the ghosts that if they do not disperse, they will be fined and sued. And that says a lot about both the Old English and the Old Norse mindset when it comes to the supernatural, which has roots in paganism, we assume. A cognate to the Old English word "gengang" is the still exists today in Scandinavian languages as "jengongre." It's a creature from superstition, presumably with its roots in Old Norse tradition. In about 730, Saint Bede highlights heathen practices. He specifically talks about how it's part of the calendar. Naturally, that calendar changed. Names of the month and things like that changed after the Vikings. He refers to offerings of cakes. He refers to goddesses. He refers to a heathen ritual around Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve. And he also explains the word blut, which we find also in Old Norse, but this is before Vikings were present in England. So this is an Anglo-Saxon word, and it means the same as it does in Old Norse. It means animal slaughter, or what you might call animal sacrifice, although all animals had to be sacrificed for food. So it was just a way of offering the meat that you're going to eat to the gods. And Blodmånad, blood month or blot month, was the name of the month in November. Bede also talks about runes used for loosening bonds magically, and there is a word drykraft that comes up, and that word also comes up a couple of years later in the penitential of the pseudo Egbert, and he talks about drykraft and Gjaldur. And Gjaldur is the cognate to the Old Norse word Galdur, which is used by witches and heathens in Seidr practices and in magical poetry. In 787, after a synod in England, Bishop George of Ostia goes home and writes a report that some English are wearing the garments of pagans. We don't know what that means, but he also says they were mutilating and eating horses. Now, this is something that we find specified in Old Norse sources, so we think that this is genuine. He also says they were casting lots, like doing lotteries to resolve disputes. There is some reason to think that this is also genuine. The Roman Tacitus talks about the Germanic peoples, I think in the 2nd century, casting lots, and that this was very, very typical of those tribes and peoples. Second stage in our chronology is Alfred. The version of Alfred's laws that we have dates to Canute and to Wulfstan, but it seems likely that the record itself is authentic, because the laws that we see to the 900s appear to be a progression of Alfred's laws. The punishments for witchcraft and paganism or heathendom are relatively consistent throughout all these law codes from Alfred up to the time of Canute. The standard punishment is death. However, if the accused repents and swears not to apostatize, that means to go back to paganism, then if they say sorry, then they're fined. Alfred's laws have different entries for heathendom and for witchcraft. The bylaw number 11 against witchcraft is a law which also mentions perjury, and I suggest that this is perhaps because it's tied to apostasy. And in that bylaw is also mentioned what could be translated as murder work, and this comes up in later laws as well, and it seems to mean the power to curse or to poison. It's noteworthy that these law codes from Alfred's time used the phrase "witchan other wiglaras," which means not necessarily a female witch, probably actually originally means a male witch. And this gender distinction seems to fade over time, as we'll see. Wiglaras means something like a person that does witchcraft, and it probably means something like wizard. But the point being is that they've tied the terms witch and wizard, if you like. It's a very poor translation. They've tied those two words together, but this develops over time, as you'll see. So the laws based on Alfred's laws have limited but sporadic appearances of witchcraft laws in their law codes. They evolved through the 900s at a time where the English and Danes are coexisting. Archaeology indicates that Old Norse and Old English preferred method of execution of witches was decapitation. And we find many of these decapitation graves with the decapitation of accompanying animals such as dogs and horses. And there is a very strong reason to believe that these animals are seen as guiding the witch into the afterlife. It's also typical to find the placement of heavy stones or a layer of flint, which was thought to have magical properties, over the graves. Altogether, it seems that this was to ensure the dead did not return as a gjengangere, ironically, which relates back to that first law code from the 500s. Briefly, I want to zoom in on that word liblak. Lib seems to mean something like herbal poisoning. It's interesting because on one hand, liblak and poisoning and the magical use of herbs was illegal. There are several instances where monks have recorded not only herbal remedies which very clearly seem to come from a pre-Christian context, but these Anglo-Saxon monks also record heathen charms which praise heathen gods and seem to recount heathen myths, such as the 9 herbs charm. While this seems illogical and hypocritical, it does give support to the reality and the authenticity of the accusations made in the sermons and law codes. It also shows that heathen witchcraft was considered to be effective. There doesn't seem to be a distinction between magical powers being real or magical powers being fake. Alfred the Great's witches, the laws from the 900s, okay, we know that they were built on Alfred the Great's laws and they were evolving, but we can be fairly certain that the text, which was commissioned by Alfred the Great, the translation of a 5th century text, Historiae Adversus Paganos, which itself was a response to Germanic tribes destroying Christian Rome. That text that he translated, Alfred, or the people that were working for Alfred, decide to translate the Latin word for pagan worship as blut. And blut was, as has already been mentioned, was described by Bede as a pre-Viking word for heathen ritual and animal sacrifice. So Bede knew about it, that blots existed, and that people knew what a blot was. And Alfred is using the word blot in 893 because it was well understood by the English. And the word was used presumably because the ritual still persisted. In other later legal documents, we find the term lac, which the scholar Audrey Meany distinguishes as characteristically different from blot. So again, we need to ask why Alfred chose to use the word blot and not lac, and how blot was understood if the practice of blot had died out. Alfred focuses a great deal on banning witchcraft and magic. Presumably he saw Danish customs as a threat and was using older Christian sources in Latin to substantiate his stance on banning the folk religions, or folk religion of the Danes. He glosses the Latin word maleficus or maleficius, and the kinds of magicians that women should not associate with, by 3 different words. Galderkraftig, someone who's good at galder, which is this magical poetry, a skin changer, and a witch. Taken as a whole, we have evidence for a persecuted religious minority. However, when the Danes enter the picture, the line blurs there with ethnic cleansing. Witches as victims of witch trials have been championed in recent years by Wiccans and feminist studies. However, we're clearly dealing with British folk religion, what the priests are calling heathendom and heathenship. So it's not the imagined ancestor of the modern neo-pagan religion Wicca, obviously, which takes its name from the Old English word witcher. It's hard to dismiss the evidence for consistent femininity in heathendom, and it's hard to ignore that women were consistent victims, both physically and ideologically. One example which illustrates victimizations of heathens of both genders, but with an emphasis on the status of women, can be seen in the reference to the Aylesworth widow. It illustrates the kinds of tensions at play in Anglo-Saxon society in regards to Christianity and ideas about paganism. Briefly summarized, a Christian man is victimized by a woman who is accused of paganism or witchcraft. Evidence is found in her home. The woman is executed. Her son, who is the heir to the land, escapes. And her victims, the victims of the alleged witchcraft, are awarded her land by forfeit of the law. And later the land is then donated to the local bishop. And that exchange from the people that have taken that land by forfeit and given it to the local bishop, that is the record that explains this situation in inverted commas on the slide. The Aylesworth widow account highlights the way secular and ecclesiastical power ideologically oppressed heathens. The account itself seems illogical if it was true, because if we accept, or they accepted, that there is no such thing as magic, then how did Christians know that the widow had attacked them through magical means? Note that the widow was found out because a magical attack was considered to have worked, and then she was investigated and evidence was found. The Christians actually affirm the reality of the magical threats. They believe in the curses and the poisons. This is something we see in both Old English and Old Norse sources. Very rarely, Christian sources will ridicule people for believing in superstition or pagan magic. It's far more common that accounts show how dangerous heathens are because of their work or their magic, and that it has to be stopped. Christianity can literally save you from your demonic neighbors, and the church is a kind of spiritual police force. The account of the deed of exchange dates to around 970. The property exchange is between Bishop Athelwold of Winchester and a man called Wulfstan, who's not related to the Wulfstan under the Bishop Wulfstan under Canute the Great. This Wulfstan guy took the land as forfeit from the condemned witch, and why this witch made a magical attack on Wulfstan's family is not explained, but it does indicate that there was a family feud between the widow and her son, and then Wulfstan and his father Eilsige. Eilsige, the father, being the victim of the magical attack. The feud between the families indicate a ethnic religious divide, and we should really think about the vulnerability of the woman there as the property owner. It's clear that the puppets or the image that was used to drive through the nails, which was the attack on the father Eilsige, it seems to it was imagined to have been an effective attack. So the secular and ecclesiastical authorities are acknowledging the same magical thinking that drove the heathen person, the witch, to act out in the first place. We can assume that in a society where Danes owned land, Christian Anglo-Saxons could use accusations of witchcraft or paganism against Danes, whether they were Christian or not. While the Aylesworth widow is not specified as being Danish, the account infers a feud between two families, and we know that one family was Anglo-Saxon. Therefore, it is probably not unusual that Anglo-Saxon and Danish families might have had land disputes where religion or accusations about religion were effectively used to have Danes removed from their property. There is evidence for this kind of occurrence happening 25 years later after the Aylesworth widow, in what is called the St. Brice's Day Massacre, which occurred on the 13th of November in the year 1002. King Athelred the Unready ordered the genocide of all Danes living in Anglo-Saxon England. However, there is limited archaeological evidence for this massacre as having occurred on a large scale, and it probably didn't happen in most of northern England, because we think that the majority of northern England was Danish. It was the historical Danelaw. However, there is one case where archaeological evidence matches with specific textual evidence, and that is the massacre at St. Feuds Church on St. Brice's Day. And this church later became Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford. And I think it was the car park that was dug up, and the bones were found at the site, and it corroborates the following account by King Athelstan himself. In his own words, he explains how he rebuilt St. Feuds Church because of what he ordered on St. Brice's Day. He says, "It is fully agreed that to all dwelling in this country, it be well known that since a decree was sent out by me with the counsel of my leading men and magnates, to the effect that all the Danes who had sprung up in this island, sprouting like weeds amongst the wheat, were to be destroyed by a most just extermination, and this decree was to be put into effect even as far as death. Those Danes who dwelt in Oxford, striving to escape death, entered the sanctuary of Christ, that is the Church of St. Feuds, having broken by force the doors and bolts, and resolved to make refuge and defence for themselves therein against the people of Oxford and their suburbs. But when all the people in pursuit strove, forced by necessity, to drive them out and could not, the Anglo-Saxons, the English, set fire to the church and burnt all of its ornaments and books. Afterwards, with God's aid, it was rebuilt by me." The St. Brice's Day massacre was remembered in England for well over a century. It was shocking in Denmark. It was so shocking in Denmark that the king, Sweyn Forkbeard, invaded, and his son Canute the Great took the throne from Athelred, again hinting that there was a large number of Danes still living in England who probably saw the invaders as liberators. We might compare this kind of thing to what Putin has done in South Ossetia or Crimea, or what the Allies have done in countries like Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. You go in to liberate people who are being, atrocities are being done to them, but at the same time, there's a lot of economical and military benefits to that liberation. When Sweyn took the throne, Bishop Wulfstan made his famous sermon to the English, where he specifically attacks what he calls heathenship and heathendom. This is not a coincidence. Although it's not specified, heathen here might as well mean Danish. Sweyn and Canute were technically Christians, but as mentioned previously, it was Harald Bluetooth who was the first Scandinavian monarch to convert. So Denmark itself was very nominally Christian at this point, and Danish immigrants to England prior to Sweyn's invasions were also unlikely to have been very Christian. So we finally get to Wulfstan and Aelfric and Canute the Great. And we now have to ask the question, why did Wulfstan change Alfred's phrase Witchan utha Wicklaras to Witchan and Wælcyrge? Is Wælcyrge a Danish loanword of Valkyrie? Audrey Meany and some other scholars disagree with that. But the questions remain then, why are witches, Valkyries, poisoners, and whores, that unfortunately is the word used, and there was no real pleasant word for prostitutes, why are witches, Valkyries, poisoners, and whores, why are they synonymous? And why are heathen practices specified and said to be taught by witches? Before we jump into answering that question, it is useful to point out that Wulfstan was not writing his sermons and laws in a vacuum. Aelfric of Ancient was also very concerned about Danish and heathen influences on Christian English ways of life. Aelfric and Wulfstan wrote their own similar versions of a text derived from an earlier Latin text, and these texts were in turn used later in medieval Scandinavia, and presumably that was because Aelfric's and Wulfstan's texts in dealing with Scandinavian heathendom were very relevant and useful in a syncretic pagan Christian medieval Scandinavia. In at least two separate documents, we can see that Aelfric sees English apostasy to heathendom as a Danish influence. He sees it being related to the general English interest in Danish fashions and culture. And it's he who describes the Viking haircut that we see depicted on the Bayeux tapestry, amongst other things, amongst the Normans who were the descendants of Danish Vikings about 50 years later, after Aelfric was writing. Aelfric talks about Danish religion as being non-Christian, and he calls it devil worship, which is an expression used by Aelfric's friend and contemporary Wulfstan to describe heathendom itself. So why does Wulfstan change Witcher and Wiglaras to witches and Valkyries? He specifically preaches against it in the same wording as the earlier laws, as we see stem from Alfred the Great, in a text which, in his own hand, he titles A Sermon to the English in the Time of the Danes. So Wulfstan is writing this under a Danish king of all England, Canute the Great, and therefore the text is clearly an ethnic, political, and religious statement. Whereas the word witch could once mean male, or maybe male and female, it seems to be now specifically female. And the other male word for witch, Wiglaras, is dropped entirely for a very specific female term, Valkyrie, or the Anglo-Saxon, Old English version of Valkyrie. Wælcyrge. So why does Wulfstan place witches and Valkyries smack bang in the middle of a very long list of secular crimes? It's because these crimes are deemed unholy due to their immorality. There was no definitive line between secular and ecclesiastical or theological law. Wulfstan, in another sermon, adds the word we have previously seen, lub, or herbal poison. He tags that onto the phrase witcher and Wælcyrge. In the study of Old Norse religion, we often talk about an interpretatio Germanica, where Roman sources on classical gods or even Christianity are given Germanic vernacular names or translations. In the 900s, the word Wælcyrge appears in Old English as a translation, or what's called a gloss, where it's used to explain classical figures such as the Greek Furies, the Erinyes, the Roman war goddess Bellona, the Roman love goddess Venus, and for mythical creatures that are associated with poison, with venom, and with snakes. And it also appears in not exactly as Wælcyrge, but it's almost that word, appears in a poetic description about a raven. And this is comparable to the way Valkyries are depicted in Old Norse sources. The word Wælcyrge is used because the Anglo-Danish audience did not know what a Venus was or who Bellona was, but they did understand the meaning and concept of a Wælcyrge. Therefore, while the Wælcyrge can be a varied figure, can be an Erinyes, it can be a mythological demon, it can be Venus, presumably she's a divine and mythological figure as she is in Old Norse. But for some reason, Wulfstan sees the need to preach and legally ban people from being a Wælcyrge. It's perhaps because, like the earlier Wiglaras, a Wælcyrge was very much similar to a witch, who was both a magical and real human figure. Witches were executed, we know this. But a witch had a role in heathen religion in a similar manner to how a Valkyrie was part of the cosmology or theology of Old Norse religion. The same practices which Aelfric specifies as the teaching of witches are also described by Wulfstan as heathendom. Interestingly, the specific Old English term earth fast stone is a cognate of that is found in the Old Norse poem Groagaldur. The god Svipdag calls on his mother, the goddess Groa, who's described as a dead witch. He asks her to rise up and help him. And Groa responds with the text of Groagaldur, and she says that she blesses him with her Galdur while standing on an earth-fast stone. And this phrase also occurs in 19th century Swedish folk magic. So we're pretty sure that this is a authentic description of heathen religion. Wulfstan goes on to use similar definitions of heathendom in the variant term heathen ship, and Audrey Meany interprets the move into the word heathen ship from heathendom as a way for Wulfstan and his contemporaries to downplay the significance and popularity of the pagan Danish threat by making it a ship, as in friendship, rather than a dom, as in Christendom. So the question, is it heresy, or is it Christian heresy, or is it pagan religion? The Old English textual references to witchcraft and heathendom have often been regarded as propaganda, as a means to paint a shadowy enemy and rally a congregation through fear of supernatural figures borrowed from pagan superstitions. However, the many specific words for heathen magical practices, beliefs, acts, places, and agents through several centuries do give reason to doubt the dismissiveness of earlier research. My supporting theory in arguing that we are not dealing with propaganda or simple heretical superstitions is in the definitions of a religion as given by scholar of religion Martin Risebrot, which his biographer Michael Stausberg summarizes as the perception of difference and how religious groups and institutions perceive each other as points of reference. Specifically, religious actors from different traditions look on each other as potential partners or competitors. I think this is a compelling way to argue that the heathens and the witches that we see in these textual sources are a religious threat and therefore on the same level as Christianity. Both Wulfstan and Aelfric, in their treatises called False Gods, use Interpretatio Romana to describe and denounce heathen deities specifically. They talk about the Danish gods, the Danish pantheon, and they name Thor, Odin, and a goddess Frigg. We don't know whether this refers to the goddess Frigg or Freya. And Aelfric and Wulfstan also use the word lack as opposed to blot. Now, it occurs to me that Freya in Old Norse sources is associated with Valkyries and witchcraft, and she is also accused of sexual immorality. And these are precisely the specific acts which the Anglo-Danish laws have condemned. The Old Norse Heimskringla states that Freya was the priestess among the gods, and scholar Olof Sundqvist, in his book about religious officers in Scandinavian heathendom, underlines the role of human women as priests taking on the role of Freya. Similarly, the work of Simon Nygaard has also argued that the skald used poetry in ritual performances and acted out that performance, that poetry, taking on the carnival aspects of Odin, like an avatar. Therefore, I think what we are seeing in the evolution of the witch and the Wælcyrge in the text is a reference to an actual clergy as well as supernatural agents, in addition to them being medical and magical practitioners. So that's all I've got for you. Thank you for listening, and feel free to contact me if you have any suggestions or criticisms, or if you have any questions about the details in this paper. Ta-ra!